like back then. Because like when you're, a teen and you're dealing with like weird Gnostic Bible stuff, like it hits a little different, I think. And going back and watching it now, it's just like, oh my god, this try hard, it was terrible. Like it's bad. The whole like getting the robot Shinji meme, like it's real bad. It really was like, and all like the Dan Brown stuff. It's just like trying so hard. Hello, welcome to the next installment of our Nemesis Oracle series. We're going to be talking about the monsters of the mountain biome here in October in Libra season. The cardinal virtue of Libra is temperance, and so we're going to be talking about three monsters which represent the absence or lack, the excess, and the misuse of the virtue of temperance. So we're looking at this mountain biome and the wounding. We've been playing with this concept of there being a particular symbol or wound keyword. We don't have them completely finalized yet, but I feel like this one's pretty good. And that is deprivation, which we've symbolized as something like a cracked goblet or a broken cup. And if you've watched my video about the elemental punishments in the form of the classic myths of Tantalus, Sisyphus, Prometheus, these ancient sort of tragic heroes of Greek mythology who were punished in various ways, the cracked goblet kind of is reminiscent of Tantalus, who was tortured for all eternity by an endless thirst that he was unable to quench because the water was magically receding every time he tried to put his lips to it. And the mountain is kind of synonymous with this because it's, on one hand, so opulent, right? There's all these minerals, there's all these things that human beings have throughout history went to the mountain to seek. And in kind of tangible forms as far as like metals and precious gems and things like that, and also intangibles, because the mountain is this symbol of enlightenment or wisdom or serenity or something that you have to make kind of a pilgrimage or a migration to in order to achieve some of these more higher order goals, right? Yeah, it's not for the faint of heart. It's definitely a very challenging biome, and it's not really a place where humans settle in great numbers or with great comfort, right? Typically, the rule of thumb, if you've watched any of Josh's videos about civilization, is they tend to be in the lowlands. They tend to be clustered around sources of water, things like rivers and deltas. That's typically where you see large concentrations of human settlement. So mountains is the direct opposite of that, and we tend to kind of avoid, or it's kind of a place of what would you say, like
refuge?
I was going to say exile or punishment.
Yeah,
self-imposed
in the negative way, exile, punishment, or refuge. In the positive way, sometimes it's a place to get away from civilization, to get away from the pressures of society. These days, that's mostly what, off the grid and that sort of mentality is basically a Highlander mentality. Like, oh, I'm going to do my own thing, go to this place that's hard to live, no one can get me up here in my defensible castle, right?
So, Josh, what do you think of this word deprivation in kind of a... It's similar to scarcity, but I felt like
it was similar to scarcity, but I think it's interesting. When I hear the word deprivation with an air sign like Libra, I'm thinking of like lack of air, like oxygen deprivation is what's like coming up in my mind. Hold your breath. That's how it kind of feels. And for the temperance, right? As it's related to Libra, there is a tendency for Libras and for that mentality to be very there's almost like a self-deprivation there of like, I'm going to go to the mountain, turn off my emotions, turn off the world, and just hold my breath and like have more control. Compatible with kind of monk mentality,
Yeah, that's where I was thinking. I got the word like ascetic really strongly because so often,
Ascetic, yeah.
especially in like in like Tibetan Buddhist and like Hindu tradition, Mount Kailash is associated with this uh, yogic practice and this ascetic meditation kind of
Mm-hmm.
turning off stimuli and focusing inward and things like that. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, kind of this. I thought of deprivation more as like this self-imposed thing where scarcity is sort of just like there's nothing available because in the mountain
Mm-hmm.
there's things available, but you got to work really hard to get it. Because there are apex predators. There is a good amount of life up there, and you look at I guess I'm kind of honing in on the Himalayas in particular, but thinking about things like cranes, and there's actually quite a lot of biomass and things that are making these great migrations across the mountains and that utilize
Mm-hmm.
the dynamics of the weather and the wind and the seasonal changes and the way that mountains
Mm-hmm.
kind of carve up the planet and create these pockets of air and weather and you
Mm-hmm.
know thinking about like it's just a very dangerous trek, but there are animals like the clouded leopards and things like that that do make their home up there and exist in fewer numbers but kind of like higher degrees of competence. So just kind of
Very
this
specialized. Mm.
yeah, this echelonic formation, this kind of
Yeah.
pyramidal, kind of goes with the mountain, and that leads into our first um, monster, which
Oh,
I'm
could I
not.
say something first about
Yeah,
that?
I'm gonna go get the sketches because I'm not prepared. Go on.
Okay. Why don't you get the sketches and I'll explain something. Something else I'm getting from this mountain mentality, I think it's very important with Libra to bring it in, is I think the positive term, other than deprivation, that we used before to refer to Libra's way of processing things or their contribution socially, I forget what term we did, but it was socialization. Socialization is like, um, let's say if they were part of a tribe of 12 tribes, that would be their job in a way. If they were a clan, socializing. So the social aspect of a mountain, metaphorically, is the city or the palace, the temple, the pyramid, like you mentioned. There's a similar mentality when it comes to, the high tower, the castle, the citadel, and
Mm-hmm.
that becomes often in its own negative way because we're talking about monsters. In its own negative way, that's the high priest or the high priestess, the controlling top word um,
Yeah.
entity, and that can also become detached, right? Because they're up in the high tower, they're in their what armchair philosophers. There's all these terms referring to this kind of how you can be basically the mentality, the depravity, the self-restraint, the asceticism of a mountain, but within civilization, propped up by civilization, kind of like the Brahmins of India. It's like we are here to just think and to think for you. Now you just pay us with tax of food and money,
Right.
and we'll sit up here on our high tower and think for you. That's a similar mentality, I think.
That's a really good point, and it really highlights the contrast between the previous entry, right? Which in Virgo we talked a lot about the psychology of the wild, and
Yeah.
the unknown and things like that. Whereas this Libra adaptation is kind of the opposite. It's the civilization force, and it's the attempt to create order out of chaos and to impose this. On the dark side, you get something like a caste system. You get an extreme regimentation. You get very strict judgment. On the positive, the redemptive quality of temperance is just like a moderation which creates, good distribution and structure and, kind of a good standard for everybody. Because if you execute moderation correctly, it means that nobody does become kind of that Brahmin at the top and impose some sort of strict rulership. But without a very dedicated adherence to temperance as a virtue in its totality, it is really easy to kind of um, get too caught up in your own point of view. And when the ego takes over, we get the monsters. And so, first one, and one note that I want to make here, uh, which a lot of feelings about, big feelings time about, we have this is the hardest project that we have ever done
Mm.
by a long stretch, like mentally taxing, artistically taxing, conceptually taxing. Um, it really has dragged on and gone through several iterations. We counted 6 completely different art styles that
Mm-hmm.
between the two of us we have entertained the possibility of. And finally, I think um, we have resolved to throw all these ones out that we're showing you now as far as the cards themselves because they just really weren't reading. And because of kind of the severity of the topic, we feel compelled to really get it right and depict them. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's a challenge, right? Because it is a deck, it's a product, it's an object. Um, but there's also this integrity of us as researchers, to try to make sure that the art style is in alignment with what we're actually trying to say and not be overly sensational or not be overly performative, to try to strike a happy medium. And that's been extremely difficult. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, this is just to announce we appreciate your patience. Anybody who has really been waiting on this one for a long time, it really has taken this long, despite being a relatively few quantity of cards compared to something like
Mm-hmm.
Gift of Virtue. You look at like, what the heck? This is 148 cards. How did you just pump that one out? And this thing has taken years, to get 36 cards, and that's just the intensity of the subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about like the the roots of evil and like the monsters inside humanity, it's not really something to trifle with. So
When you're
thank you for
doing
your
real art, when you're like doing really extensive art and you're trying to make sure you're happy with it, and that's its own dragon, you know.
Yeah, it certainly pushed me to my limits and questioning,
Mm-hmm.
what is good art. And this has also been hitting us in a really weird place on this threshold of, the advent of AI and how AI has factored into our practice and our process and all of those things. And like, what is art? What is fine art? These are all really heavy topics, so they need to be considered with sincerity.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so all of the art that we have been featuring is going to make its home in the art book. And kind of the premise, I guess, just to tease a little bit that we've come up with is that in the cards there needs to be a real clear form. It needs to be much more not cartoony at all, but like simplified, like very stark, right? Very contrast. And then in the art book, a lot of the realism that we have poured time and effort into illustrating these things is going to show up there because the art book is a different process. As you're going through that, you're really interacting with the writing that we're going to do and the concepts, and it's just a more curated journey. Like you're being led through this. So like the unmasking and the exposure to the monsters and the realism is going to be much more authentic in the art book, whereas in the decks it's like it's an impression, right? It needs to just very quickly communicate an idea and be very striking and clear. So that
Mm-hmm.
really long-winded, but that's where we're at with that. So here is the first monster.
Alien or an
Alien.
angel,
Yeah, yeah. So the
angelic being,
concepts, this is the excess. Sorry, it's not in the notes quite right.
excess of
Excess
temperance,
of temperance. Yeah, so that's
which is the
the
definition of non-temperance, but also, and it's an alien or an angel, is on high looking down upon everyone, and it's not like they're enacting much on anyone usually. Like they could create a tyranny, but it's mostly just criticizing, you know, analyzing, judging from afar. Those little ants, those little primitive people down there.
yeah. We want to be real clear, not to mince terms. We were kind of on the fence
Yeah.
about using the word angel at all because we don't mean like guardian angel. We don't mean like angel guide or something. Like we're talking about biblically accurate. Be not afraid. Like the orders of angels, as more of an elemental being, not like some sort of benevolent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. So
And we need angel in like a critical way as well, a critical pagan way, which would be like, that is an angel really good if they're that judgmental being up there trying to pull strings? Like there's a question in there of just like the morality of the idea of an angel, because people can assume that, oh, it's a good thing, but like there's many arguments for why It's not necessarily healthy, even if you were just having an angel do everything for you or help you out along the
Mm,
way, do a bunch of Deus Ex Machinas for you. Kind of like the
right.
definition of a god coming in and saving you. It's like,
Yeah.
what right do they have to decide the fate of mortal beings and so on? Like it's a debatable, it's debatable whether angels are good or bad in the first place. Really.
Right. Yeah, we mean it in the way creepier, like Evangelion kind of way,
Hmm.
like Lord way, not the like cozy angel number way. Just so that's clear.
Hmm.
But in the depiction, we actually for this one went way more towards like the elf or kind of alien,
Yeah.
because Josh has
Aliens.
really strong feelings about aliens, and we both have strong feelings about elves. So like that elite race kind of thing comes up in this archetype a lot, or like the belief that there is like a superior way to be or a superior thing. And it's very, we were talking about it yesterday in preparing for the video. It's like, it's kind of a weird thing to really believe and lean into that like original sin or like flawed humanity. It's like there even if there were something superior to humanity or there were a superior form of it, like it would still be accessible, it would still be attainable. But the hallmark of this archetype is actually its unattainability and its inaccessibility. It's like completely removed, right? It's an alien on a spaceship up in space looking over you.
Hmm.
It's an the angel on the cloud, like it's completely removed, like you can't even touch it. So like it's kind of unreality itself. It's pure concept,
And that's
you know.
what I think. Whenever I've analyzed my fear of aliens, which I've had from a very young age, me and my best friend actually both do. But we just love alien movies and alien abduction stories and whatnot. It's definitely like my favorite monster, if I could have a favorite monster. Um,
Mhm.
a lot of people don't think of them as monsters. Like they wouldn't think of it as a cryptid necessarily either, because that's usually like an animal. But like they're all the same thing. They're all these shadow things. But what I've analyzed over the years of what's scary about it is perhaps I have issues with not wanting to give up control of my
Mhm.
senses of myself, and the idea, I overthink things. I'm very intellectual, and so the idea that something out there is incomprehensibly, I guess, smarter necessarily, or like more powerful, is looking down on me, has a plan, has some sort of goal that I can't possibly make sense of. Because that's what's pretty creepy about aliens. It's like nobody knows why they're doing what they're doing. Why do they abduct people? Why? I'm not saying that aliens are real, by the way. I have to put that out there. I'm not saying I think they're real and all these abductions are happening. I'm not trying to go, conspiracy theory up on you. Um, I'm a little bit, I want to believe in terms of my actual feelings, but like in terms of belief, I don't really have a very big belief in it actually being the way that people say it is. But it's sure is fun, and it's entertaining, and it's creepy. But
It's your Aquarius rising. Want to believe?
I want to believe, well, just because it's fun. I want to
Mhm.
believe whatever's fun and weird. Uh, but I don't. But anyway, it's
Well, tell us your favorite. Why don't you just give us a rundown, your favorite examples in the
mhm.
movies, since that's been kind of a thing we've been doing.
Well, I feel like there's a lot because I and my friend always liked aliens. We would always watch alien movies or media of any kind, and so many have been quite disappointing because usually it turns into like basically ghosts, where they would have some sort of supernatural power. They possess people, something that is no longer, I don't think, an alien. Something that's more like
Mhm.
I don't know, just a ghost, which we will talk about in this episode, I guess. But what's really scary about aliens is like the abductions, which is the actual accounts, which are mysterious
Mhm.
and strange. What are they doing? And some movies that we felt like actually got that feeling better would be like
Mhm.
Fire in the Sky is actually a pretty dang scary movie.
Yeah.
A lot of people would say that like
Gosh, I may watch that for the first time. That was a trip.
it's pretty creepy. I mean, I think it's a little over over dark in its depiction of the aliens. They look like they're just in some um I guess alien equivalent of a very poor hospital or something, or some very poor, I don't know. It's pretty
It's a
over the
lot.
top, but
If you haven't seen it, this is probably the archetypal one to do if you really want to get
yeah.
freaked out. I would say it's
Flash some scenes in this video. You weren't afraid of flashing some scenes in the last video when you were editing, so flash some scenes in that movie. Just a moment. And yeah. So that's like, that captures the feeling of like, at no point is it ever obviously explained why the aliens were doing what they were doing, and it was always very ambiguous. Like everything that happened was like ambiguous enough that it's like, did this really happen or was this a dream?
right.
And that's kind of another part of it, that's interesting, is like the ambiguity, I think, of not knowing exactly what happened, memory not quite being there, everyone questioning you, is part of what makes it extra scary. Is like they have
Mhm.
control over your mind and your memory, and they can change, and they can put ideas in your head. There was another movie that I don't think was very good, but it had an interesting premise where, I forget what it was called actually. Too bad. It's not good anyway. But every time that a person was abducted, they had a vision, that they thought it was a dream of an owl staring at them at night, and it was always at 3:33 a.m. And every time at 3:33, these people would be abducted, but they would have their memory wiped, and so they didn't know what happened. And there's this really scary scene where she's like, um, she's recording herself at 3:33. She's talking into her microphone about the day or whatever, and the time passes over, nothing happens. Later she listens back to recording, and she's like screaming and being taken away, or something's happening right at that moment, and she had no memory of that happening, right? And we, in that previous scene, didn't see that happening. And so there's that ambiguity. What happened? How they have this much power over our thought, right?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting point. I mean, with all of the alien movies, kind of, and just alien lore, I guess there's
Mm.
this really prevalent theme of like the witching hour, or like being late at night, being in this very liminal space that kind of is between waking and sleep, and having
Mm-hmm.
so much to do with this, like the nature of reality and
Mm-hmm.
the human mind itself. And I think
Yeah, the
that's
human
all kind
mind.
of like crucial to it and really interesting. And I think that makes for the strongest alien movies. I guess the only other one that I would bring up is Contact, because they made us watch it like a million times in school for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
Very educational. Um, yeah, and just the idea of like a greater mission or a greater
Mm-hmm.
plan, or like why are they doing this? I think that's just like really tied up in our insecurities about our own purpose and meaning, and like hoping that there's kind of someone out there who has some
Mm-hmm.
answers or something like
Like a
that. So
federation
yeah, this kind of
that's out
this
there, and that
fiction.
maybe they've figured shit out so that we don't have to. Yeah,
Yeah.
that does come up a lot. That's I showed you the what's it called? Is it The End Is Near? This Is the End. Um, the what? It's the bar at the end of the universe or something. You know what I mean? It's the Simon Pegg movie.
Yeah.
Um, it was basically an alien takeover that people started getting body snatched, I guess.
Hmm.
And the whole end of the movie, it's just like, they're just like, humanity has to be replaced because you're so bad and you suck. And they're all, of course, Simon Pegg and all them are like rebelling. They're like, what gives you the right to tell us what to do? That's exactly what you're talking about, really. It's just like,
Yeah, well, there's several archetypes that we've actually kind of splintered off that are kind of wrapped up in that, where it's like the body snatcher is a fear that we have. Um, the mimics, or kind of like the thing, that's all
mm-hmm,
kind of a fear that we have.
it's a
So
little
that's in a
different.
different
Mm-hmm,
category. Yeah, but the what you're saying, just the mental aspect of that, or the judgment aspect of like um, that almost
what's
crosses
best
over
for
into
you?
some of the Gemini ones too. Of yeah, like what is
Mm-hmm,
that the machine
mm-hmm,
fears, I think, are very similar to the alien fears. And of course, there's
mm-hmm,
alien machines is a huge one for us, because it's
mm-hmm,
like this judgment of like, are we, just parasites on the earth? Are we destroying everything?
mm-hmm.
Would everything else be better if we weren't here? That kind of like really extreme self-loathing.
last note on the aliens, I do have to mention Signs because it's me and my friend's favorite alien movie. Because a lot of the other ones, like Fire in the Sky, they're not that fun to watch or like rewatch or anything. This is a really good one to watch, and it captures that energy. I always love the scene where they first see the alien at the birthday party in like Central America somewhere, and it's that's always spooky. But in terms of our theme, like you don't really know what they're doing. You don't know what their point is. Apparently, the point was they were supposed to harvest humans. That's why they went to Earth, despite the fact that there's water on Earth, and they apparently can't handle that, which doesn't make sense. But everyone can complain about that. It's still a solid alien movie about signs that nobody quite understands why or what, and they're trying to interpret it. And it's good creepy aliens.
I don't remember the name of it, but the Etsy alien movie is still my favorite by far.
Oh yes.
That one was really good.
Yeah, we have to shout out
just
that
as
one.
an entertaining movie. Like I'm severely biased because like the whole thing revolved around like the deep self-awareness and resistance to hostile alien takeovers that you're endowed with when you're a small business owner, I guess, or something. That was kind of a fun theme. I liked it. Is that
what that theme was?
Yeah.
I guess that's how you interpreted the theme.
Ships
very personally. She was definitely basically on Etsy. I don't think it was it wasn't obviously literally, but she was definitely on Etsy.
Apocalypse survival skills. Yeah, and it's important to keep in mind that like this idea of whiteness or light is so central to all of these archetypes. If you look at like Tolkien's elves, like the light, they're obsessed, and it's like pure white glowing light. So it's like, you know, however white you think you are, there's always going to be something like whiter than you and better than you. Like it's just this zero sum kind of situation. It's just the extremity of like once you get onto that slippery slope, right? Once you get onto that track of like the hierarchy and ranking things in that way and valuing you know, lightness in general, it's kind of there's no end to it. Like destruction and annihilation is kind of the end result. And so that's why like this archetype of the light at the end of the tunnel, there's a finality to it. There's like a complete destruction. And to segue into the angels a little bit real quick, I actually went back and I was watching Evangelion again just for giggles because it's on Netflix, right? It's just too easy. I remember back in my day, you had to go down to the WYSIWYG store and you had to purchase a DVD imported, and they were coming out like at the time they were actually released. And that kind of stuff had such an impact on me, I guess, like back then. Because like when you're, you know, a teen and you're dealing with like weird Gnostic Bible stuff, like it hits a little different, I think. You know, and going back and watching it now, it's just like, oh my god, this try hard, it was terrible. Like it's bad. The whole like getting the robot Shinji meme, like it's real bad. It really was like, and all like the Dan Brown stuff, it's just like trying so hard. Like no kidding. But the way the angels are, it's kind of interesting subversion in Evangelion because they're actually kind of so neutral. Like they're kind of just like this natural force that's happening. And it ends up being so much more centered on the humans as being the judges. And ultimately, like the annihilation comes from the humans themselves because of their own feelings of inadequacy and their desire to form this singularity, because like there's just no agreement that anyone can come to about who should be in charge or what should be happening. It's just like war constantly. And so like the only way to end the war and end the strife is to congeal into a weird singularity situation. And then, you know, Shin Godzilla was basically just another Evangelion and kind of reconstituted that whole thing. And it's very interesting. There's a lot of that kind of like early anime stuff that explored those themes really thoroughly, and some of them are kind of popping back up now. I find it kind of interesting, but it's like this internal war and this like this whole concept of worthiness and human value. It's interesting that symbolically comes up as angels so much, or like this superior race or Ubermensch comes up in this. You know, what is it about the wings? What is it about like the visual of that? And like I think it's really fun when people do the extreme realistic, biblically accurate angels where they've got all the like
Like
rings
it's
with the
all over
eyeballs and stuff.
everything. They're
Yeah.
incomprehensible. They're basically cosmic horror at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Because yeah, they're trying to be incomprehensible because they're beyond your understanding. That's the whole idea. It's like, oh no, you don't. You're beneath. You don't understand these higher levels of existence or whatever. That's the whole premise.
Right, but like the extremity that's necessary to make you feel beneath, like
Mm-hmm.
it has to be at this cosmic core completely incarnate.
Above
So
and
it's like,
beyond.
shouldn't the answer be right there then? Like if you have to go that far to um, demonstrate our own worthiness and therefore uh, that we should just die and give up and stuff like that. The weird duality of that, the nihilism of that, and then like
Hmm.
the polarity, right? Because Libra is all about polarity. It's all about right and wrong, good and bad. Um, so this extreme black and white division gets grappled with, I think, under this archetype more than the others. I think that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
its bag a little bit. So ultimately, that self forgiveness and self acceptance is, the virtue we call grace. So like
Mm-hmm.
temperance ultimately has a lot to do with grace and extending it to yourself and others. And so the
Mm-hmm.
the real problem with the superego is how few situations in reality and the one we're really living in, not the weird alien cosmic horror, how often it comes up is very slim, right? There are situations where the superego does need to prevail and does need to exert some limiting forces on the ego and the id. But the proportionality of it is somewhat echelonic. It's going to be kind of like the tip of the iceberg that those are actually applicable. The vast, overwhelming majority of the time, as far as our actual physical life needs, and the reason, when we look at like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's a fat bottom, right? It's the big chunk at the bottom is the base of like our
Mm-hmm.
survival needs like food, shelter, warmth, basic biological things like need to take up the lion's share of our attention, and a disproportionate amount of our solutions are going to be oriented in that direction. And where we really get into danger and where the superego becomes a problem is when you do transcend the physical realm and you remove yourself from it and you become ascetic, you enter into this idea space where there is no upper limit and there is no limiting factor tying biology and the relevance of reality
Mm-hmm.
into these calculations that are happening. So there's no upper limit to how the superego finds itself to be the solution to
Mm-hmm.
every problem, even when this is not grounded, this is not tested, this is not verified by anything else. And so, like, the more removed you get, the more other anything physical seems to be, and the more
Yeah.
gross and guttural or whatever.
And
But
and the solution to each problem at that level becomes another meta level. And
right,
and people will tell you this. I've heard people talk like I'm talking right now, and it's not ironic and it's not critical. They actually mean this. They're like, everything at the meta level, you get that level, and that's how you solve that level. And then you get to the next level, you metaphorize that, you meta that. Then you can solve that, and you can solve every problem by metaphorizing it. And it's like, no, no, you can't. Like you're saying that and you're philosophizing that, but that's not solving any problems, and you're just there's a lot of mean terms I could say that I probably
no,
don't want to say
it's
on
it's a
YouTube for
really
it,
weird
but
paradox. Like this air elemental thing, it's a really strange paradox because out of everybody, the mental capacity should be such, right, that
mm,
there is an awareness that it's like, oh well, if we look at the data, what the data actually says and where these things were applicable, they were exactly this many situations. But there's something that just uncouples, and it's
mm-hmm,
so easy to just get removed and abstracted from.
abstracting,
Yeah.
rationalizing,
And
circling
it's not
around.
it's there's a really weird paradox that because I'm kind of obsessed with the elements. I don't know if anybody could tell that from the everything
Mm-hmm,
we do. But I came up with this cutesy little phrase because I think real cute sometimes, which is to err is human, AIR, not ERR. Oh, God, I'm just so fun sometimes. Well,
to air.
in
Mm,
exploring the difference between different elemental systems, right? In China, you have five. In Druidic system, you have three. And so, like, why is that happening? What are the differences? And the solution that I've come up with in looking at like the Renaissance elements is that air is an element that is exclusive to humans for our mental capacity, our prefrontal cortex, and how we're able to live. Because in the Druidic system, the three elements, water, fire, and earth, are verbal. They're very action oriented. And then when you bring this air thing in, it's so uniquely human. I don't know how to describe it any better than that, but like animals are kind of existing in this verbal elemental stage. And yes, animals have complex thinking, they have all of these things they can do, but like as a mode of life, air is something that is kind of so unique and special to us and really defines us in some ways, but it has to always be kept in context with the others because it really does run this danger of being the gaseous form to just expand and go, and with nothing to contain a gas, it's just going to continue, you know, in entropy to the ends of time, right?
So trying to capture that gas and
right. Gas is very useful when it's contained. When it's just shooting off into space, it's not so great.
That's true.
So I think that concludes it.
I think we're concluding is yes.
Yes. So the next monster, which represents the misuse of temperance, right? We did the excess, now the misuse.
It's the Harpy. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm in love with the drawing. I really love how it turned out. It's very kind of like Hawk Girl, but like, yeah, this is one of the reasons that we're so butthurt about the card art and changing things, is you dump all of these hours into
making really good art.
It's like, yeah, let's not do that at all. Okay, fine. It doesn't feel. I'm very excited about the art book and what we're going to be able to express with that. It's a new format. We've never tried it before, and I'm super thrilled to work with Josh on that and see what kind of storytelling we can do with these concepts. The videos help shape up some of these ideas, but there's just something about that mode of art. I guess that's kind of the closest to like how I thought about art in high school, like back when you really have the time to just be doing it for your own thoughts and things like that. You know, and you're journaling a lot and you're trying to figure out how you feel about the world. So I think this archetype is really kind of close to that because it, I don't know, it's a very prevalent theme in art, and it's very interesting because we went with the word neutrality. This is almost kind of like a deity level spirit, you know, in looking at concepts like the Valkyries that we're going to talk about. But like they're not necessarily named characters, if that makes sense. Like part of the fear that goes into this monster is actually kind of its own neutrality or its own lack of its anonymity, if that makes sense. There's going to be a few monsters that do really
they have a mask?
There are going to be a few of the monsters where the anonymity actually is a really prevalent theme for them, and this is one of them.
They're hordes.
They're hordes, yeah.
There's a few monsters of ours that are hordes. Aliens, by the way, is kind of a horde too, because there's not just one alien. That's not the archetype. There's always a few weird, short, or big, tall things at the end of your bed at night.
Okay. There's one that you have like a really intimate encounter with, and maybe you manage to best it or defeat it, but then it's like, there's we have friends. Yeah, so.
No, they work in groups. I think some of the there's a few of the air signs that actually come with multiples. I think Gemini is it has complete multiples, but Libra, yeah, I think aliens and harpies come in packs.
Right. So the Harpy is the vulture, so it's like the vulture's circle, scavenger. And there are multiple of them. Yeah.
They're coming to rip you apart and take your pieces for aims that you probably don't know. Like it's hard to tell why. Valkyries, of course, are a positive twist on this idea. Valkyries in Norse mythology, of course, they carry off warriors to Valhalla, off into the west, but they're based on an older archetype of these spiritual vultures. Really going back to what vultures actually do is they eat dead corpse. If there was a battlefield, they would be there, and they would take people and eat them. And in Egypt, the idea is that the soul was taken by these vultures, and then they go off into the west like birds do, at night or in the evening, and not to say they all go that direction, but the idea is like, sunset is when the souls go over the horizon and are reborn. They go to the underworld and then they're later reborn in the east. But so the idea that these vultures would go take away your soul and then they would be reincarnated eventually. They became kind of a spiritual force. And so the Valkyries was a form of that eventually evolved. The Harpies are another, I think, form of that. Just the idea of these kind of scavenging spirits that are trying to take you, body and soul, and pick you apart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to look at the significance of different burial practices and different cultures. And this in particular, what we're talking about is the sky burial, where the bodies are left uncovered and they're exposed. Usually, there's like some kind of platform built or something like that. But they're it seems to be kind of like steppe or plains cultures.
The Iranians did that. It was actually an Iranian, Aryan Iranian.
Does sometimes as well. It's
interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we talk about this a little bit in our food staples video as well, but just how much these taboos and social mores evolve around things like our food cultivation and also burial practices, like huge taboos, really strong, things that people go to war over, basically, these really strict dividing lines between cultures. Obviously, in some places that are more like wet and have a rainy season, this leaving bodies out in the open, not such a great thing, not really. There's risk of disease, there's all of these problems, and so it's interesting to note like which cultures are very strict cremation cultures, which cultures are very strict burial cultures, and this idea of the sky burial, which does seem to have so much to do with the spirit as well, and making sure that the spirit is varied, because birds are thought of pretty universally as messengers at the very least.
Messengers, harbingers, psychopomps. Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. Just for a very quick history lesson, a lot of ground burials happened during, say, the Neolithic cultures that were practicing agriculture, and it was actually Indo-European, Iranian, and other cultures that started to spread cremation very heavily. There is a correlation between this kind of sky burial and cremation and like an Indo-European mentality versus like more Neolithic. And there's, mythologically speaking, I talk about videos on my channel all about this, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but mythologically speaking, Neolithic people were very chthonic. They were very grounded, earthy, accepting of the earth, and so it makes perfect sense that they would want bodies to go back into grounded nature and become part of the earth or the world, and then recycle into a fertility kind of cult. Whereas Indo-Europeans, they actually tend to have a very kind of detached, airy sky sort of worship, celestial focus. And so the idea is that the soul should leave the earth and go into the sky or into the heavens, and not be dirtied with body, not be dirtied with bodily things. This is something that also passed into Vedic philosophy, as well as in Iran, and then into even into Zoroastrianism, which then influenced Christianity much later, or Christianity and Judaism at some point through the Babylonians or the Persians, and created this kind of ascetic distinction. It's like sky, celestial good, chthonic ground bad, and that's something that's very prevalent in the big three religions, right? Abrahamic religions. They are very anti-ground, pro-sky.
Yep. So it's interesting, I guess. I don't know a whole lot about the Nordic history and stuff like this, but it's interesting you see this kind of iconic hybrid in the Nordic tradition, right? Of these like boat burials where like you put the body on a boat and set it on fire. It's like kind of neither of those things, and yet we see like the Valkyries in that. So to like what is really scary, I guess, about the Harpy, it's also like all of these Libra ones are going to have kind of the theme of judgment. So like the judgment of the soul against the scales. If we get back to like the Egyptian again, you got Anubis with the feather, not by accident, right? We've got birds and feathers, weighed against the weight of your own heart, very symbolically. There's all of this like being judged to death and whether you lived a worthy life, whether you go to Valhalla or heaven or what have you. It's a big fear, and this monster in particular, for whatever reason, really speaks to that. It could be, we did also in the art
scrutiny.
really distinguish, despite the fact that the alien has kind of like the angel meaning, we didn't want to be too repetitive in the imagery, so the harpy ends up having the more angelic form, I guess you would say, but in its kind of extreme.
It's dark dusk angel.
Yeah.
I mean, there's dawn angels and there's dusk angels, right? There's Ostara, and then there's Morgana or Morgan, right?
Yeah, and form-wise, it's similar also to the Sphinx, which we touched on in the Yo video a little bit, because the Sphinx is ultimately a judge as well, and we talked a little bit about like the never-ending story example and like seeing into your heart and shooting you with the eyeball lasers and stuff. All of these supernatural beings that have this ability to see through you and to kind of, penetrate into your heart with their gaze. I think the harpy kind of both does and doesn't do that. Like the harpy is actually somewhat indiscriminate. It's just if there's a corpse on the battlefield, it kind of doesn't matter. The picking apart, like we've mentioned, it's just like their nature. There's something so like indifferent and kind of non-judgmental also. So it's kind of interesting. We did put the Valkyrie here as kind of this judge, but there's also something so like natural about the Valkyrie. Like they're just really doing their job. It's not like they necessarily, I mean, there are some like named Valkyries, but in the research that I've done, and I'm not an expert or anything like that, it does seem to be a somewhat neutral party. Like they're not acting on behalf of anyone. They're not necessarily judging by any deity in particular standards. They're sort of just, in an almost more Klingon-like way, just like, did you fight with honor? Yes, no, but it's not necessarily factoring all those other things in. It's sort of like your only criteria is, did you die in battle? Did you die honorably only at this time? And like the sum of all of your other deeds doesn't really play in, as far as I understand it, with the Valkyrie myth, is like, it's sort of just the intimacy of that moment of death, and like the rest of your life is sort of whatever.
Well, Odin was originally, not to go too long into this, but Odin was originally the psychopomp of the West. He was I think he's called, Velinas, or basically he's a Western wind, or the wind that goes to the west in like Baltic and then Norse. And so he would have his chariot or his his horse or his ride or whatever, and he would go and take the souls across the sky into the west. And so he established Valhalla as this hall in the west, and the Valkyrie kind of represent the selective, again, like you said, the feminine selective power. And so there's a host of them that are selecting for traits essentially and taking them into the halls of Odin, really. So Odin's definitely in control of them, but like really it's like it goes back to this kind of chicken and egg situation, I guess, of like which came first, the masculine leader of the Valkyrie, or the idea of a collection of women who are selecting for people, which would kind of resonates with the Hore, right? Who are all these female deities in Greek mythology, indicative of the Neolithic period, that were actually they all represented good aspects of human nature, good aspects of society, and regiment and control. And on the dark side, control and priesthood and all that is what happened, but also in the good side, like socialization, social control, regulation, selection, right?
Mhm.
But there's an aspect of them that in that demonic form is picking at you and criticizing every piece of you. It's almost like objectification, right? Because in that way it's judgmental but still impartial in the way you're saying. Because it's like, oh, we don't care about you and like your soul, like your feelings. We're picking at you and your body and the parts of it, and we're just gonna objectify you basically. And
Well, yeah,
like,
it's did you do what you were supposed to
yeah, it
compared
doesn't it
to.
doesn't matter what your intentions are. It doesn't matter what you felt or what's going on inside. What is your behavior? What's your action? What's the consequence?
Yeah, and it's interesting that that has so much to do in particular with the war behavior is like because to be a good soldier, it doesn't really matter if you're a good person. It depends on if you followed your orders or not and
Or
you
if you
did what
won,
you're supposed to. Right, and you won.
if you
And
helped.
so like it's interesting that when you get to that higher level social order when it comes to things like organized violence and war, they require that kind of impersonality and, you know,
Mm,
sort of forfeiture of your individual virtue. And so the collective virtue then just becomes, yeah, victory at any cost. Did you do what you
mm-hmm,
were supposed to? And it's very fascinating, not to like go too hard, but since you kind of brought it up with like the Neolithic stuff, um, I'm blanking on the title of the book. I'll put it in the description. But one I read not too long ago about the female selective mechanism and what it was
mm,
actually originally trying to do. It was the book about our cooking behaviors and our
mm,
the beginnings of socialization and how societies kind of became civilizations through that. And it had to do with sitting together face to face, eating meals,
mm-hmm,
detecting threats through our eye contact and lip reading and all of these are really finely tuned facial expression things that started to evolve kind of during that early hunter-gatherer period where we started sharing meals and establishing our hierarchy according to like who was allowed to share and how that was done and kind of the beginnings of what we think of as perhaps like the nuclear family or sort of like these mono pairings of couples and things like that had to do with this transactional exchange that we started to have, which had to do with the feminine cooking. How such an incredible amount of time had to be dedicated towards gathering firewood and water and doing cooking stuff, depending on what culture you were and what you had available, right? But we started to have this social contract where we agreed, like, okay, we're going to try to divide the labor, and it takes this much work
mm-hmm,
to go and acquire um, the stuff to cook, this much effort to cook, and the net gain of cooking the food rather than eating it raw is this much more available calories and this much more, um, therefore, reproductive power because you need excess calories in order to increase your population. You need stable food supply through cultivation and agricultural practices, like you're talking about that Neolithic advent.
mm-hmm.
That really started to change those
More
behaviors.
centralized control. More
What's
need for a super
fascinating
ego socially. You
the
know.
super here's what gets real weird and very interesting and creates this sort of feminine paradox is from this book and other things that I've read like the research really shows that the female selective mechanism is selecting against reactive aggression.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they studied chimpanzees, bonobos, and these things, what really distinguishes us, I guess, from other primates and things it has to do with this reactive violence because in order to have a cohesive family unit and of course not be killing on each other and have a tribe, it's great when it's the other enemy tribe. You can be as reactively violent and go nuts, right? But within your tribe you can't have that, otherwise it's just not going to work. And so the female selective mechanism is really sensitive and really selects against aggression and reactive violence. And so much
Mm-hmm.
of those pro social behaviors are geared towards minimizing that. So it's absolutely fascinating when it comes to a symbol like the Valkyrie that has to do with war and has to do with aggression, how that gets turned off and has to kind of be turned off when it comes to warring against a threat or a neighboring tribe, because there has to be a very special contract or a very special trigger, right, in order to turn off that pro-social
Mm-hmm.
societal, we're not going to beat on each other, we're not going to do the violence. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, but go do it to them though, right? There's a very specific like go
Oh well,
signal.
I think it's I Well, actually, I would go further than that. I don't think it's something that's like, okay, turn that off for them. No, it was true for them too, because diplomacy is an important part of Libra too, right? And diplomacy is an important part of civilization. You can't, as a tribe, realistically and sustainably be just enacting reactive violence on every tribe you meet. The most idyllic thing to do, and what they found is kind of the thing that most tribes usually did, is tit for tat, right? And that means when you meet a new tribe, you're open, you trade, you're nice, you consider them to be a friend. And if they ever mess with you once, if anyone steals something or they fight you, then you're done. You're the enemy. And maybe they'll give you one forgiveness, one chance at forgiveness, but any more than that, you're done. You're the enemy. And so there's kind of an attitude of Ishtar, of Athena, of this Eurinome, this many names feminine selector deity that's associated with Libra and Venus, is this goddess. She's a warrior and she's a sex icon, and she's a goddess of justice and of civilization and harmony and selection, but also war and wrath and justice. These are things that have everything to do with that conscience you're talking about, of of discernment, of being able to be like, okay, this is okay behavior, and the moment that you step out of line, hell is going to break loose on you. No forgiveness.
So we talked about how the excessive judgment can be really horrible because, it's got this nihilistic, destructive, perfectionistic, puritanical, scrubbing of anything inferior. That's a problem. But when we look at this issue of neutrality, it's actually quite insidious as well, because it's not so much evil in the world that allows for evil things to happen, right? There's very little evil as such that really gets through or prevails, right? What really allows horrible genocides and catastrophes to gain momentum is not so much the charismatic initiators, that we think of as far as the mass murdering fuckheads of history, but the people who stood by, right? It's the people who allowed evil to happen, who saw it happening, and just went about their business or just did their job. And so,
or they're cynical and they don't think anything can be done about it, that it's just human nature.
Yeah, so this is the, when we criticize Libra very frequently, it's for their indecision or their inability to make a decision, or getting caught up and spinning their wheels endlessly over possibilities rather than kind of being decisive and laying a course. And so what makes this monster really horrifying is the anonymity, as far as it could be anyone. It could be you. Like, anybody in the right circumstance could be complicit in evil, even if they themselves don't have evil intentions, or like they don't go out to cause harm. They don't have, they're not racist, or they don't have anything against a particular group, but one thing leads to another, and, you get Zimbardo's prison experiment. By the end of it, things just get onto that slippery slope, and they descend into this sort of, I'm looking for a term. Plausible deniability, or deferring authority to someone else, giving your power away. Yeah, refusing to take. Yeah, it's anarchy. Yeah, so that's I think what makes the Harpy really fascinating. I'm actually having a lot of trouble coming up with specific movie or cultural references because of its sheer neutrality in a way. I guess the birds. I don't really know. Yeah, it's because it's just like, it's just this force of nature. But we had talked about, and I appreciate you bringing up because I didn't really think of it, that the Valkyrie is sort of the feminine aspect, and then the masculine aspect of it goes back to kind of the Odin stuff, or to the plague doctor archetype of sort of being along for the ride and kind of removed. And
the animal archetype would be a raven. And the raven is obviously common throughout mythology as something of a trickster. But just like the vulture, they're a scavenger. But a raven's very much more intelligent in a kind of way, like selfish, intentionally selfish, definitely trying to like they like shiny things, for instance. Sometimes ravens are associated with like gold and precious jewels and things like that in mythology because they steal it. Because they do. Like if you actually know or you're around ravens, or some people own ravens, they pick up nice and shiny things and they collect them in their nests and stuff. Like, and they fight for them, fight each other for them because they're not a unified force either. They cackles, right? Crows and such. They do hunt in packs or they play in packs. Really, they're more like play. And I think they have male groups, right? I
I don't know much about it.
I heard that ravens have. I think they have like specific groups of males that stay together almost for the rest of their life, and they just kind of run around, mess around. If you've ever seen, like, I remember going camping. Last time I went camping, there was three ravens or crows. I think they were crows actually, and there were just three male crows, and they would just be kind of playing with other animals, like messing with other animals. I think there was a squirrel in a tree, and they kept trying to like peck at it and get him out
Hmm.
of his hole. Maybe they wanted to steal some of his nuts or something. It was weird, and they were making all kinds of weird sounds. And when I came by, they would very much acknowledge me, and be like chattering about me. Like they're very intelligent and strange and tricksy
Well, and
creatures.
also the type of intelligence, because they are very vindictive and they do
Mm-hmm.
have grudges, and they are pretty good at memorizing like human
Mm-hmm.
faces. And if you do them a favor, they'll return a
Mm-hmm.
favor. They're very transactional,
Mm-hmm.
and calculating, which is very interesting. I guess kind of
Mm-hmm.
the closest maybe parallel we would find in movies and stuff would be like pretty much any of the post-apocalyptic type movies. They might not be depicted so obviously bestial as we're describing, but
Mm-hmm.
there's so many characters in all of these kind of apocalypse movies that are sort of, I'm just passing through. I just do, things for myself. I'm selfish
Mm-hmm.
scav, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's always the one that's like, I guess the one from Willow is kind of standing out in my mind, where it's just like, I'm just out for myself, and
Mm-hmm.
then at the last minute they're like, yeah, well, it was on my way. I just happened to be,
Yeah.
the bad boy
Well,
kind
you
of.
remember the crow? Who's the crow assistant of in Maleficent, right?
I don't remember his name, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, he's based on Fair Doiric, right? Which is the dark crow assistant. And just like,
Hmm.
Hunin and Munin, the crows of or the ravens of Odin, they're often assistants of another deity or another force or whatnot. But I think there's also an Amerindian, I believe, myth. Or no, is it? Oh, in the myth of the Hydra and the Corvus in Greek mythology in the constellation. It's all the crow is also a bit of a trickster. Like I think it was Apollo that told him to go get a stick or something, or to go get something, and he took a long time. And he brought a snake and said the snake did it. The snake made me take long. And then he put them both in the constellation because he could tell he was lying. And so they're kind of like a unreliable assistant.
Hmm.
Um, they can be deceptive. They're a little selfish.
A lot of blame. Yeah.
And of course in the Maleficent movie, Flair Doric in that movie is he's like the quintessential goth dude, right?
Hmm.
It's like yeah, whatever, man, sure. Like he's got his own selfish aims that are a bit cynical. And I'd say that'd be a pretty accurate description of that archetype. So yeah, there's a masculine form. The visual I had was a plague doctor, which is an ambiguous beak. It's not actually specific what kind of bird that is, but just the idea of like there's pestilence and there's this kind of energy that's a bit cynical, but also is technically helping.
Hmm.
Is like it's the symbol of the plague doctor is kind of a symbol for these days. It's kind of a cynical, dark symbol, a morbidity, right? It's almost like really accepting that death is inevitable. It's another form of death in a way, though it is still aiding. It's capable of, like, through wearing that mask, they are capable of entering the environment that's dangerous, right? It's a form of like a psychopomp going into the underworld and being able to return without kind of losing itself. There's a certain mentality and a certain amount of, coverage that they have to do in order to go to the underworld and back.
Okay. And so last we have the complete lack or absence of temperance, which is despair, which we have as the Wraith.
Mm-hmm. The Wraith.
Ooh, spooky.
Ooh. Oh.
Spooky ghosts.
I mentioned earlier ghosts. Yeah. So ghosts would fit under this. It's a very common idea because of, I guess, Lord of the Rings with ring wraiths. They've kind of popularized that and the imagery of the hooded sort of death ghost skeleton thing that you see it in another realm. You can see their true form. That idea. Really, it's a ghost. It's a cursed ghost that's cursed to linger in the world and not pass to the afterlife or the underworld. They're lingering on the earth because usually there's some task or something binding them. In the case of ring wraiths, it's the rings. They're binding them into semi-physical forms in order to perform loyalty or service, right? But in the case of many myths, and even like in Phasmophobia when they play it, a wraith is a type of ghost in there, like with ghostology or whatever they call it. Is there a word, phasmology? What do they even call that? Anyway, whatever. Spiritualism and whatnot. Wraiths are considered to be a soul or potentially a demon that has a mission that isn't fulfilled, and it's corrupt, like a corrupted soul, basically. So that's kind of the energy I think you captured well with that image.
Yeah, it's sort of that that ideology, or like you said, that you're making a pact or having an oath, or
Mm-hmm.
being bound to a particular place.
Mm.
Having that idea transcend even your
Mm.
physical mortality, and having there be something of you that is able to still cling to and impact the world. Um, you know, Really, that is ideas though, like that is ideologies, because like you can come up with
Mm-hmm.
something that outlives you by a lot, through your ideas, for better or for worse. And
Mm-hmm.
so the wraith, as far as like despair, is kind of like bringing in that nihilism of like the sterility and judgment, but
Mm.
sort of like extending that nihilism and sort of like spreading it
Mm.
to other people, or like making it in a form that is available through this haunting, right? Because
Mm.
to haunt someone
Haunt.
is to demand their attention and to like take up their, you know, your
You
your
won't
cut.
pass on. It's like someone else moves in, and you're like, "This is
You're
my
like, hey,
house.
Right, yeah. So
You're
in
my
the case of something
space."
like a poltergeist who can actually manipulate physical objects and things like that, these physical happenings or like these spooky things are demanding the attention of the living and sort of calling their
Mm-hmm.
attention to death, calling their attention to that ultimate end and nihilism,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of obsessing over it. So it's kind of an obsession as well
Yeah.
with a particular thing. And it's in the case of the wraith. When I was drawing it, it's not obvious from this part of the sketch, but when I get the environment more done, the idea was a reflective pool or mirrors, or kind of like that
Mm-hmm.
being that backward facing obsession with the past and
Mm-hmm.
some particular loss or wrong, and
Yeah.
kind of that infinite loop of regret and
Eternal recurrence in the way. It's like constantly reliving. Because I think that's the most spooky. That's the scariest, I think. Because I do like ghosts too, honestly. So like aliens and ghosts are both pretty creepy to me. Particularly, I like shadow bastards. Shout out,
Mhm.
shadow men. They're very mysterious. But what's What's most scary about them is kind of the idea that uh, they are a soul that hasn't found a way to escape. They're reliving. Like, the scariest thing about them is trying to think from their perspective, trying to empathize with, like, because like I don't believe in ghosts literally, but like it's again kind of like aliens fun to think about, and I often take the perspective of like, okay, what would it be like to be a ghost? And when you do that, play that game, you start thinking up rules and you start making up kind of a lore about what it would be like to be a ghost. There's all
Mm,
kinds of like hypotheses out there, or visuals or stories about it, but I always felt like what was most creepy is the idea that you'd be lingering where you spent most of your life. Kind of like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, that you would be not necessarily reliving your life, but you'd be reliving the spaces that you lived in, and you'd be reminded all the time of how much you wasted. Like all the time you spent in your bedroom. It's like you're going to be spending a lot of your time in your bedroom as a ghost, or like maybe pieces of you are everywhere you've ever been, and you just have to see that forever and just be reminded of how little you traveled, or how little you experienced in your life, and you just have to live that forever. That's terrifying. And I even have the idea that the more times a soul, so to speak, would linger in a place, that all these energies in the afterlife of being a ghost are like collected into a kind of collective consciousness. And the more of these different spirits, wraiths, are lingering in the space, the stronger that wraith power becomes. And so a wraith could be like all of these different souls trying to reach out, trying to, maybe people who are lingering in their spaces, um, their experiences like, go live, like, don't be like me, don't live like I lived. There's certain things like that that are like, that are creepy, I think, to me, most creepy, if you look at it like that way. It's sad, like really this sad. And with, I just want to say also, um, with some words that we use for these three monsters, was like oppression is alien, repression is the harpy, and then depression is the wraith. So this sort of depressive state of lingering and staying and not moving forward, not being really alive, being undead, not in a
mhm.
zombie way, but in a disembodied ghost way. Because zombies, that's a totally different archetype. But a wraith is this thing that does not have an effect on the world anymore, and that's why they constantly, like poltergeist, try to do something. I always think like when they do that, that they have like an energy that they lack in energy. They just have to spend it. They like have a certain amount of energy they're building up for like days and days and days, and finally they're like, oh, I can push over a cup. I just want to exert some control over my world, which I wasn't able to do when I was alive. And I just want, that's creepy, I think, and desperate and sad.
Well, so the whole premise of haunting, is like it's calling attention to this unexplained thing, right? This unseen world, these unexplained forces, and sort of like on the conspiracy theory side of things around the real like superstitious, like why do people spend time making ghost videos? Why do people spend
Mm-hmm.
time, and like yeah, it's entertaining, it's fun to speculate,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of fun to be scared. It
Oh yeah.
provides a certain role, but like it's interesting that there's definitely like a maladaptive side of it where like in its extreme form, an excessive focus on death and obsession with
Mm-hmm.
that
Morbid.
leads you, yeah, to just like kind of not live your life and not engage with your life anymore. And we were talking about the tradition of like Dia los Muertos and like
Mm-hmm.
healthy rituals of mourning that sort of create a protected space and ritualistic time to deal with death and mortality and all of the things that go with that in a healthy communal way and
Mm-hmm.
kind of create an outlet that is has its own time and space, when the veil is thin. And Samhain, of
Mm-hmm.
course, does this as well. And Halloween traditions where it's like, okay, we as a society are going to take a couple days and scare each other and deal with all this. And, I think it's really healthy to have that outlet. But when that, outside of that kind of structured context, sort of just letting that become kind of a constant obsession and fixation, does, I think, lead you, yeah, to be kind of stuck in place. And it takes away from things like new experiences and novelty.
Mm.
And I think, yeah, the despair, the depression, psychologically, depression really impacts your sense of time. And I think, time and reflection are definitely themes to this Wraith character where it's like, um, you get so few years on this earth alive and then you spend eternity haunting the place and just like these kind of
Mm-hmm.
ideological extremes and like this idea of like what is a wasted life. Like the more you obsess over that, the more you inevitably do end up wasting your
Mm-hmm.
life and becoming overly reserved and cautious and in trying to protect yourself you kind of live in a bubble
Mm-hmm.
and fail to do the things that are meaningful and that you would look back on if you had like a photo album or something.
Or if you were a ghost, you would look back and see that you were in this bubble. And then they'll live in that bubble again, and you'd be like, no, no, I don't want to live in that bubble forever. I didn't think I had to. It's terrifying. I wanted to bring
Mm,
up Coco, right? Because
mm,
that's a really good kind of exploration of some of these themes. Of course, it's Pixar, so it's much lighter. Um, I don't think there's any explicit haunting going on in that, but there is because the not the main character, main character's actual father, right?
mm,
He's fading
mm,
because their spirit only exists as long as exists in whatever state it exists as long as they're remembered. So there's kind of like a lore system going on there, where the celebration of the dead creates such a reservoir of memory for the culture. They have pictures, they're celebrated yearly. There's such a respect and understanding and acceptance of death and of that a lot of those spirits, they don't linger. They have an easy passageway to their afterlife kind of city thing, and they're able to live in that way for a long time because they're remembered very well. And you know and you can imagine in other parts of the world where it's not as respected, how in that Pixar story wouldn't be quite the same. It would be a lot of spirits lingering around the people who remember them, trying to be remembered, trying to reach out and push some things down to like communicate that they're there, right? It would be a sad story. Um, yeah.
yeah, well, because it's just what is the purpose of remembering, like
Mm-hmm.
why, what is worthwhile about these lifetimes that's worth inheriting or passing on or calling back attention to,
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very clearly illustrated in Coco, sort of all the different skills in particular is kind of how they, which is a little bit surfacey, but I think it's still kind of cute.
Mm-hmm.
The people that are remembered fondly is like, oh, they were really good at making shoes or whatever, or like they have particular quirks or virtues that kind of resonate in the generations of the family. And um, I think the thing that the loudest signal about Coco was that regardless of the particular virtues, it was like his connection and like finding someone just to relate to and to like not feel alone or not feel like he was the odd one out or that his interests were weird, So whether or not a particular family member's virtue in life was objectively, like, oh, yes, that was a life worth living, their character and like their relatability ended up being such an important factor just because it made the living beings feel their place in things and feel their context of the family and everything and like
Mm-hmm.
feel that things made sense and that their path made sense and that it was kind of like led them to self-acceptance because it was like, oh, well, so and so did that and it seemed to work out
Mm-hmm.
reasonably well. I'll do it a little bit different, but what I'm doing is not fundamentally wrong, you know.
And there's this positivity that is shown to their ancestors then, right? A
Mhm.
positivity. There's kind of a assumption in a ghost hunting again that you get the energy that you put into a place, that you'll
Mm,
get feedback, that these spirits are feeding off of your energy, whatever that means. So if you have positive feelings, then they might react positively or otherwise be at peace. And if if you have more negative feelings or anger or fear, that they'll feed on that energy and then they'll start doing scary and crazy things, right? It's kind of yeah, it's another part that's kind of creepy about ghosts in general is there's of course these assumptions on certain mentalities that all ghosts are demons, they're not actually your loved ones because your loved ones are of course in one of two places, and there could not be any people on earth lingering afterwards because that wouldn't be in line with our philosophy of life, and so when they do believe that ghost stuff happens, though, they say, those are demons pretending to be the people you love. And they're trying to corrupt you and make you feel like they're not where they should be. Right? And that's a really weird gaslighting going on there. Um, of course, I'm not saying this is all literal. This is all definitely happening. But like trying to take the perspective that these are your souls lingering in a place and they want to be understood and respected and loved positively, to have someone say, no, 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 you're a demon, and then to project all this negative energy on them, I think it's kind of interesting to think of how, because since Libra is about conscience, how all these thoughts from other people are impacting the appearance of a ghost or wraith or demon. Because it's demonized, then it becomes demonic. I think that's a much more interesting idea. Is like if you have all this negative energy that you're feeding into it, then it will become negative and feed back onto you.
Mm. Well, it's interesting if we just for a moment, like if we just put all of the ghost stuff away entirely and
Mm-hmm.
like look at it as just depression, right? So if we look
Mm-hmm.
at perhaps this wraith as a living being, that there are people on Earth right now who
Yep.
are experiencing this deprivation wounding that is resulting in a very real clinical condition, which is depression.
Mm-hmm.
Like what are the failings that are causing this suffering, in people, and like to what extent can we as human beings band together and try to prevent some of it?
Mm-hmm.
Depression, it's a heck of a knot to untangle. I've read many, many books about it
Mm-hmm.
and still can't really make heads or tails of exactly, there's just so much conflicting information about nature, nurture, chemical behavior, it's all over the place. And it's like, well, obviously when someone is suffering from anything, there's a wound, something is hurting them, so we have to at least give the benefit of the doubt that there is something doing it, and exploring this deprivation wound, and like what leads to nihilism, what leads to suicide, what leads to despair and like giving up
Mm-hmm.
and like not being able to connect to self-worth, and there's a lot in the ghost symbolism and things like we just talked about with Coco, where like there's wounding that happens during the course of the movie, as far as like his family's disapproval of his interests and
Mm-hmm.
like shaming him and trying to distance him from association with his father, which of
Mm-hmm.
course that kind of intergenerational trauma and like shame is a wound. It's like there's a very real cause, there's a very real behavior that would need to change. um, and there's not it's not entirely on the person themselves. There's a lot of external forces of other
Mm-hmm.
people's super egos in that movie and in those kind of stories
Yeah,
that
his
are
mother
imposing,
is really
and
strong.
they're creating an environment where it's impossible for this person to thrive, and so they get to a certain state where they're stuck enough,
Mm-hmm.
through that reinforcement externally and through chemicals that have developed in attempting to cope with that
Mm-hmm.
onslaught, where they're stuck. And like I think you do reach a point where you can't necessarily just claw your way out. And, I don't know that medication is always the answer either. Obviously medication is not going to stand up to continual abuse that you're suffering from. If the
Mm-hmm.
if the causes are still in your environment, you can't just drug yourself
Yes,
better.
and that's a huge thing. We won't get too much into that because it would be an entire new topic we'd want to put research and everything into. Um, but yeah, I mean, for me, speaking for myself and my moments of depression in my life, or entire periods, uh, trying to make sense of what the causes are. I mean, there are so many causes, but I'd say for the relevance of maybe the themes we're talking about today, it was like lack of socialization, like when being disconnected, feeling like a ghost when you're alive. Like, does anybody remember me? Does anyone know me? Like this loneliness, of like feeling like
Would
you
anyone
can't.
even notice if I was dead?
Yeah,
Like,
would anyone notice? That's the thought that comes in a lot, and then like mine definitely had a lot to do with loneliness. And like I had some people in my life at that time, but because of the quality of those relationships, it was essentially talking to them still felt like I was a ghost, or it still felt like they weren't actually, almost like I was in a different dimension, or right, like I wasn't actually directly interacting with them as authentically, and they weren't authentically connecting with me. So it's not just a matter of, oh, go outside, which is what a lot of people say about depression
right.
or loneliness. It's like, yeah, but I need to find somebody that I can actually connect with, who's going to be real with me, and where we can have a place and a space and some time between all the work and all the other things that take my soul apart to be real, right? So that's something, like being real, having real close friends, that's something that cured it for me. Having an environment where I was free to be myself, like having an environment where, like, I lived on my own and I chose my interactions was also a big solution, because if you're feeling lonely, you have all these other people, kind of like in Coco's situation, the mother and all these things, exerting all this control and shame. You're not going to want to see people. You're not going to want to interact with people. And so you're going to make things worse. Things are going to get worse for you. So if you can just like sever connection with the people that aren't actually helping and reconnect with yourself, and then start opening up to new connections that are actually feeding you in a real deep way, that would help. So like, yeah, I'm feeling like, to me, depression, yeah, has a lot to do, or at least in the case of a wraith, to be as though a wraith in life is like feeling like you're not affecting the world, like you're not affecting anyone, like nothing's affecting you. Eventually it starts to feel that like numbness, right? Because that's the feeling is numbness, and it is a feeling. It's a sort of, I think I've explained it, very airy, like I've explained to you before. It's kind of like holding your breath. It's like just holding it and just not being able to breathe, not being able to exchange, because you're not having an effect, and nothing's having an effect on you. You're closing off, separating, disconnecting. And that's really like what a ghost is. It's this disconnected thing. And you can definitely live a life that makes you feel like that. It's
Mhm.
not just fantasy we're talking about here. We're talking about actual things that people experience. It's possible to feel like a wraith in life.
I think part of what makes the wraith and the alien so poignant then, and in relation to this issue of nihilism, depression, suicide, and such, is like because they are so unreal, because they're so unexplained. I think um, our desire to kind of tussle with the unknown and the unexplained, I think these are sort of projections, like these characters that we've created and these monsters are sort of projections of concepts like depression itself, where like
Mm-hmm.
we are hoping perhaps that by playing with these concepts and exploring them in this abstract way, that we could come up with some sort of explanation or solution that we could apply
Mm-hmm.
to something that is so enigmatic like depression. I think that
Mm-hmm.
might be part of why we're doing it. And the more um, we're kind of creating this parallel, especially with like the alien or like this idea of superiority, we're kind of like creating this parallel non-human thing that has power over us, is superior to us, impacts us in this negative way, oppresses us. I think when we're talking about aliens, we are actually kind of talking about um, the limitations of our own biology when it comes to certain um, evils, or like biological evils, right? There's a few main ones. You've got depression proper, you've got postpartum, and that is a super scary one. And it's like there's just not really a lot talked about. It's not something we're really allowed to talk about, first of all.
Postpartum?
Postpartum.
Explain.
Yeah,
What's that?
that's what women experience. There's an
Yeah.
intense
Okay.
hormonal pendulum that can happen after you give birth that actually causes you to reject and not bond with the baby. And sometimes, in extreme cases, even sort of like fully reject and perhaps even cause harm too. However, consciously, unintentionally, there's just this detachment, or there's something just breaks chemically.
Empathy
Something
breaks down. Yeah.
Well, it's just like it's so taxing on the body and the mind and the neurochemicals. Like sometimes things just break, and depression is like that too. And like certain things under extreme stress, you know, our biology can completely betray us. And we don't really have explanations for that. And I think that sometimes some of these monsters or like things that we conceptualize as evil are sort of these projections that we're trying to use to explain evil within ourselves, when there's things that do sever our connection between our conscious intentions and who we want to be, and like what choices we would make if we did have control, and certain things that put us completely out of control of our own bodies. You know, like hormones and neurochemicals that are more powerful than us sometimes. So I think that these symbols in particular speak to that. Of course, we've talked about other monsters that might have to do with things like aggression, violence, hostility, bloodlust. Like all of those things are essentially come down to neurochemicals as well. But this depression one is kind of interesting as this cocktail of neurochemicals that could be thought of as monstrous and take possession. You know, because we'd spoken a little bit about possession as kind of a characteristic that could be held in common between the alien and the ghost, right? If they actually possess you and take you over and make you do things that you don't want to do. You know, I've heard people describe the experience of depression as, you know, sleepwalking or not having control at all, or just going through the motions and being on autopilot, or like something actually having control. And so it's interesting that we have these symbols and these beasts that kind of embody those phenomenon. That's all. So, in conclusion, we have the monsters of Libra, of temperance, whose wound is deprivation, more specifically, perhaps self-deprivation.
Attachment, perhaps.
The biome of the lofty mountains, where living is hard and you have to be self-sufficient.
And cold.
Thank you guys so much for joining us for this third installment on the Nemesis series. I hope you're enjoying some of these monster archetypes and just the different perspectives that we're bringing to the table and analyzing them. We got some history today, got some mythology.
Yes, if you like it, like, subscribe, comment, please.
Yeah, and bring up other, like, obviously these are not exactly exhaustive lists.
Bring up some other examples or movies.
Yeah, movies for sure.
Yeah.
What, like, specifically, what is scary to you in movies, or like what makes a particular monster like something that you yourself wouldn't want to transform into, or like that you see dangers of becoming, right? Because the whole purpose of this is not just like, here are monsters from, you know, if we wanted to do that, we would have made it a deck that's just like, here's all the different monsters. But like, we've been very, very intentional with our selections of all of these psychologically as phenomenon, as things that, you know, we can become, and we want to avoid becoming, perhaps.
And that's part of why we use astrology, is not just to say, oh, Libras, this is what you're like. That's not what we mean to do here. We're just using that as like a mnemonic system to break down some archetypes of elementally into these three for every sign, just as a way of seeing, trying to be complete, trying to be, what's the word? Thorough?
Systematic, as always.
Yeah. We're just trying to account for as much as possible.
Yeah. We'll see you guys next time.
Yeah, see you guys
Enjoy
next time.
spooky season. Bye.
Cookies. Oh, wow. Bye.